Life of an architect right there. It's just like a seventh inning stretch. That's what that was. I see. Look at me with the sports reference.
Ooh, you're sportsing.
I'm sportsing right now. Yeah, I am. I have a glass of wine and I'm sportsing.
Exactly.
Go. Yeah, that's why I'm
team.
sportsing. Yeah, do the thing. Win the points.
Yeah.
Go sports.
Score the basket. Thing.
Kick the ball into the basket. Yes. Do it.
So yeah, it's just been one of those. It was what was interesting is it was a week of I went away to take my son up to college and
right
prepared everything up until to get to like being able to walk away because I was conveniently or inconveniently, however you want to look at it, going to be away from my desk when we were submitting for a deadline.
Oh yeah. That's always perfect timing. What could go wrong?
Everything.
Yeah, we'll get there.
Yeah.
Don't want to give away the punchline yet.
Exactly. Well, so I leave and I guess you could call it unforeseen, but it's always seen, right? You always assume that something's going to happen. And yes, it did because.
Right. Of course.
We're provided by this particular owner a list of review comments that they've had, and then they give you kind of like this level of acceptance or rejected, and whatever.
Revise and resubmit.
And so this was, I hate to say it, this was a resubmittal, and so that was all prepared, ready to kind of go, but my responsibility in making sure that all of the comments were not only answered, but then also sent, addressed and QC it and make sure that we've got everything in there. So the document itself, a very, very important document.
Yeah, you're just like now I remember the text messages.
Yeah.
That were,
so then, so then I get a couple. So I did get one of apparently a whole lot of frantic texts, calls, and emails, which apparently something was up with my phone because I got one and I did mute that one because I was in the middle of something and I couldn't take the call. Yeah. So somehow, some way, I conveniently or inconveniently, I'm going to go with conveniently, screwed up something on my phone.
Mute.
It might have, one of the things that I didn't even check is, did I accidentally put it in like airplane mode or something instead of, I think when I could have when I was turning it to whatever, I could have put it to airplane mode, but
it doesn't matter. You're not your desk anyway.
I didn't.
The messages would still come in at some point, even if you did put it in airplane mode. So something went wrong.
Yeah, something went wrong. And what happened is that they're like, "Hey, Cormac, we're looking for these comments, but the file that we have, nothing. There is nothing there. There's comments, but there's no responses." I'm like, "No, that's wrong. I mean, we were with me. We went through a handful of them." And they're like, "No, they're gone. No, they're not." So I finally get back.
You're in denial. They can't be gone.
So get back Monday morning, open things up, realize, they're gone. And then I'm like clicking through because it's an Excel file and there's a whole bunch of other tabs, architecture, interiors, pool, blah, 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 all the way through. And so I start clicking through all of the other ones. Now, my file only had responses for architecture. There was no other responses. We got the other responses would come in and we would merge the two files. Guess what happened?
Overwrite.
Not merge, overwrite.
I was, you.
100
I'm pissed about this.
160 comments that took me weeks to do, gone.
Yeah, I mean, and that's why you took your glasses off.
That's why I took. Exactly.
You did the seventh inning stretch with your face.
Yeah.
Because, And my question is, how the beep does this happen in today's world? And it's
Yes.
what's crazy, Cormac, is like I can say that, like, how in the world can this happen? And yet so many firms still work this way. Oh, I'll email you a copy, and I'll email you a copy, and I'll email you a copy, and we'll merge all the files in the end. And inadvertently, I mean, nobody plans this in advance, but
Right.
this overwrite thing should not happen today, ever.
Do you know why?
I was pissed when you told me that this happened.
And do you know why it shouldn't happen even today on this particular occurrence? Because what I did was I sent everybody a Teams link.
Yeah.
To the shared document that everybody could work in. But what happened? Somebody most likely downloaded it.
This to my machine.
Exactly. Did their thing. Everybody got all of their stuff. And instead of just distributing the actual link and let everybody work on it, and I don't care how many people work on it, just get in there, do your thing, have fun. Guess what? We would have a total document. And even if we get the document back rather than overwriting it, why not just go ahead and merge it? There is a tool within Excel that you can compare and merge two documents that are the same but have different things.
Similar but
not
different.
To say that I don't want to sound like I'm condoning the idiocy that happened, but there are ways around the idiocy if you're going to go down the path of idiocy.
My goodness. Okay, before we go on, I just want to, because we're still under the 10-minute mark here, I want to let people know that we're going to talk about architecture here in a minute. So don't stop listening. I want to talk about your trip that you just went on. But before we continue, I just want to let people know that, because the whole episode isn't going to be about this, right?
Oh, no,
and I think it's important in the first 10 minutes too, because something I've noticed, Cormac, is people stop listening precipitously after about the 12-minute mark. So there's our attention span in architecture land. It's about 12 minutes. So we're going to do something right now to advocate for listening longer in this episode to a really cool architectural field trip that Cormac went on. Okay.
Yes.
But I just wanted to do a little intermission there and let people know that was coming so that you can continue this mind-blowing, mind-bending rant that is appropriate.
But I will say, exactly, I will say, and I would like to actually put this behind me and not think about it anymore. So, we could move on to the thing. But I will say that this is the kind of things, these are the kind of things that you have the discussions about during your, when you're project managing something, when you're putting together your workflow, when you're assigning tasks, that these are the kind of things that you just have to look out for. Make sure you're not doing something silly like, oh yeah, by the way, you set up something that everybody can get into it and use it at the same time, a la going through Teams in this particular case. But I'm going to go ahead and download it. So when I download it, maybe somebody should tell somebody in advance that, hey, I'm about to copy over all of your work. Just to let you know, I know that you've been doing this for about 2-3 weeks. Maybe you might want to know that you should save it onto your desktop. So, and of course, everybody's like accusing me. So, well, why did you save it on your desktop?
Yeah. Why didn't you do the thing that we're all guilty, that I'm guilty of doing?
Yeah. You're like,
yeah. No, you did it right. And that's what makes me angry about this is that you got your work done early.
Yeah.
And you get penalized for getting your work done early because your shit's gone. Like it got overwritten. That's crazy, right? And it is mind-boggling to me that people think email is a file system. It is not a file system. Yeah. Stop emailing yourself files. Find a better way. Like wise up. Get smart. Like how people still do this. And it's not okay, first of all, email is not private at all. Email is an open completely unsecure system.
Mm-hmm.
Anything that you email to somebody else could be just lifted out of the digital airwaves. It is
It
not
should be
secure
just
in
because.
any way.
Just because you're doing it. It was just like, just because you did this, here, exactly, take this.
I mean, and if your client knew that stuff was just going out over email, it would be like, what are you talking about? And I'm sure they're guilty of it too. But it's important to say these things that certain people know. Not everybody knows. People can't be punished for not knowing what they don't know. But it's at the same time, like, it is the technology team's imperative that they convey this information over and over and over and over and over again, because there is turnover. There's new people showing up all the time. There's people with really bad habits. There's people who like to do it the way they've always done it. And it turns out that there are better ways to do things. Yeah. And it's got it, like, how heartbreaking for you to come back after a vacation and have to do the same thing over again for multiple days and try to reconstruct what you already took care of. Like that
do three
and the
do
project
3 weeks
just
worth
takes the burden. Yeah,
do 3 weeks worth of work in a day and a half.
Yeah.
Because I did spend at least a half a day trying to like scour like my temp something. And to be fair to whoever, sabotaged me, I did recover about 1/3 of the comments. And so I only had to go through 2/3 of recreation of, some very complex comments and stuff like that. And then go through the documents and say, okay, where is my responses and the changes reside? It was just it was something special. It was something special.
All right. So I'm glad that we had that therapy session. You can now move beyond this. Deep breath, let it in, let it out. Man.
Yeah.
All right. So you did get to do a very cool field trip.
I got to do
super
some
jealous.
very cool stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
So on a couple of different occasions, when I've taken my son up to school, now where we live is in the Detroit metro area, and we drive up to the Upper
see it
Peninsula.
On your t-shirt. I can see where you live.
Detroit? Yeah. And this is just like when I get lost, they say, where are you from?
Yeah, me too. This is my
exactly
when I get lost shirt.
Is that
step back into the hedge?
From the abyss, you live in the abyss, the darkness.
Just like that Homer Simpson, receding
exactly
back into the hedge. That's me.
Except for yours has got to be at night.
It's a black hedge. Yeah,
exactly. the blackthorn hedges.
So this is what you wear when you get lost, and people.
This is what I wear when I get lost. Yeah, exactly. So we take, like, on occasion, in fact, even when, about, what is it, I guess now, 2 AIA conventions ago, I had taken my son up to school, and then I came down and met you at the AIA convention. And every time I drive past, I'm driving through Wisconsin. To get from there down to Chicago, you drive through Wisconsin. Beautiful. You drive through the back roads and all this other stuff. Beautiful things. But you pass these signs, and there's tons of signs all over the place advertising the Frank Lloyd Wright Trail.
It's like when you're in the East Coast and it's like George Washington slept here.
So so I also, just to kind of also set the stage, was listening to an audiobook from, was it Ada Louise Huxley or Huxtable? Huxtable, yes. That the Frank Lloyd Wright biography.
Oh, nice.
And just I'll leave my comments of, like, it doesn't paint a rosy picture of how kind and nice he is.
I'm sure. Is it worth listening to, though? I mean, can you make a recommendation?
Absolutely. Yes, okay. I do. I would, because it does actually teach you a lot. It teaches a lot about somebody who, in a somewhat he did it to himself, but somebody who had so many different rebirths of, count him out. Nope, he got back up. Knock him back down. Nope, he got back up. Knock him back down. Nope, he got back up.
Wow.
And it was amazing. And there were some things that, obviously were beyond his control. And I'm sure if anybody who knows the story, knows, some of his own personal family tragedy, that, that would wreck somebody. And to be able to get back up, it's, pretty impressive. And I don't know how your school and your education kind of treated the, teaching that portion of architectural history, on how, like, we had people who came in teaching a very opinionated, like, take on what they thought about Frank Lloyd Wright. And so, a lot of times that would rub off on my education, or just like, Frank Lloyd wrong. Or, it's just like, hey, you're becoming an architect. Do you want to be the next Frank Lloyd Wright? Like, no, I don't want to be the next Frank Lloyd Wright. I want to be, and it's just like, but the more and more you go and you visit his work, whether or not, you look at it through the lens of like a project manager that says, well, of course that was going to leak because, look at the details. Forget that. Put all of that aside.
Right.
Oh, my Lord. Oh, my Lord. I mean, the dude, he knew what he was doing. For somebody listening to this book who did not complete architecture school and, started and then basically had the stance that, what can they teach me about architecture? I don't need to know any of this for what I want to do in architecture. So I am going to quit school. And he did. And, for somebody who had quit school with a very, very short period of architecture training within the academic profession, to be able to do what he did, pretty damned amazing.
It was something like over 500 projects, right? It was like that actually got built. Is that the right number? I don't know for sure.
It was an insane amount, and, of the ones that got built and of the ones that still exist. There's a lot of really good, if, people are on Facebook, there really is a really good bunch of different groups that are kind of dedicated to Frank Lloyd Wright. There's one that I belong to called The Right Attitude, which is kind of funny. But it's curated by a bunch of docents who work at a lot of the different Frank Lloyd Wright houses and are just a complete wealth of knowledge. They've studied as a Taliesin fellow and, really are, carrying on this tradition.
Yeah.
But before we kind of get into like, what I saw and experience and things like that.
I know. I love it. I love how you're building up like the suspense here, because we don't even know where you visited yet, but this is good. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I found really amazing, and so this was one of the questions that I wanted to ask you. So, we have all of these starchitects, Zaha and, Gary and Morphosis and all of these people. But are they really, and the reason I want to ask, are they really, when there's a project in a town, like say there's in Milwaukee, there's the addition to the Milwaukee Museum of Art by Calatrava, right? And that building doesn't have like for miles and miles before you get into Milwaukee and miles on the other side of Milwaukee, signs telling you that there are buildings from that architect in that town. But there are, if you're Frank Lloyd Wright.
It's not a fair comparison. He's long gone. There's a foundation. There's all these things there's these groups, there's these Facebook groups. Like to be a little bit fair, like driving down I-5 from Oregon to California, there is a sign for the Sundial Bridge. It doesn't say Calatrava on it, but it does say the Sundial Bridge is this way. It's like everybody knows what that is.
But regardless of that, they basically say Frank Lloyd Wright buildings exit blah blah blah. They don't say like, some of them say wing spread or, things like that. Some will say that, but
a little foreshadowing right there.
Exactly. But there are, but I mean, it's just, they're down in, it says down in Florida at the Florida Southern campus that he designed. As you're going into Lakeland, it does say the Frank Lloyd Wright Florida Southern Campus buildings. I can't remember. It's been a while since I've seen
this.
it.
Yeah.
But, there are signs that basically say, hey, there's a Frank Lloyd Wright building over there. You want to go check it out? Get off the interstate here and go this way. And then
that's
they just like
right? Because that's not there's no tour there, I assume.
No, there's not.
Yeah, it's just like a campus you could walk around. I could totally understand that for buildings that you can take tours of, because the foundation probably pays for those signs that then leads to ticket sales for tours, and it makes sense. I mean, just to your point though about like the docents who run these Facebook groups and the level of expertise and knowledge that they have. When I was at Taliesin West, I mean, there was an architect leading that tour who had also graduated from that school, and the depth of knowledge and how far back that goes is absolutely incredible. And like that is one of the things that really sets these kinds of tours apart, whether it's, Taliesin West or if you're in LA and you go to the Hollyhock House, or if I'm sure there's, the Guggenheim, and there's all these places that have that level of sophistication of attracting talent to lead these tours, to then proliferate these stories, which also helps kind of reinforce like the architecture that people get to experience when they're on those tours.
So let me go one step further. So this is where my story of my tours begin. So as we're driving down.
That was plural, people. Just listen. Yeah.
Yes. So as we're driving down, we're probably about, say, 30 miles or so north of Milwaukee. And we were going to stay in the Milwaukee area, kind of a somber anniversary for my wife, and her father had grown up in the area. And so we were going to stay there for, reasons. And so we had already known that we were going to be there. And that day, we were going to kind of like hang out in Milwaukee and Cudahy, and then basically just kind of like drive along the Wisconsin coastline of Lake Michigan and, just kind of explore. So other than 2 tours that I had signed up for in advance because you had to, everything else was unplanned, which is very typical of us. It's just like, let's explore. And as long as you've got a very willing navigator, which thankfully I do,
that's awesome,
then you're going to find something, and it's going to be really kind of fun and cool. So, I was just like, hey, we're going to be going on these tours tomorrow. You want to see if there's anything Frank Lloyd Wright in Milwaukee? Because I don't know. I don't know the extent of, buildings within Wisconsin other than the buildings that they advertise across the Frank Lloyd Wright Trail. Mm-hmm. And so, she's like, well, yeah, there's a house. It's about 15 minutes away. Well, let's go see it. It's just
what did people do before smartphones?
That's true.
It's just incredible.
You're right. I mean,
you would have had to figure this out.
I would have had to have figured this out. I would have had to have known it was there and then map it out, because there's another story,
or a Thomas Guide,
or even before that, when it was, in the late 90s, when you didn't have MapQuest and you needed to just say, okay, there's a building, like say, for instance, the Rosenbaum House, which is in Florence, Alabama, only building that he did in the state of Alabama. And I had to like go on, pull out the old paper map and then just look at where's Florence and how do you get to Florence? And then once you get to Florence, try to figure out where it is once you get there, because it may not have had a sign. I think it did actually have a sign, though, even back then.
This gets back into like asking for directions from a Southerner.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Which some people mistook that was something that I was criticizing, and I really wasn't. I mean, there is a beauty in an art to the way that, that directions are given.
Somebody left a comment on our YouTube video. It said, "Turn left where the old oak tree used to be."
Exactly. Well, somebody else had criticized, it's just like, you ever listen to a Northerner give directions? I'm like, I mean, fair enough. Right.
Right.
So, okay. So 15 minutes away. So we go. And it's Joseph Molina House is what it was built for. And so we're driving there, and it takes us into this really like North Milwaukee suburb, all filled with ranchers, you know, like larger like ranch houses and stuff. And we're driving through this windy neighborhood, and, you know, there's like, no, it's not there. And then Siri's like, you know, your destination is on the left. And then, you know, it was one house off of where it was, but we didn't quite crest the corner where we actually saw the house. And so it was just like, no, it's not. This is just a ranch. And so we were like, okay, maybe they had it wrong. You know, we started to drive. There's some people out for their evening walk. And so, you know, we were just kind of like slowly driving past them. And then I saw the corner of the house. I'm like, oh, there it is. And so, of course, we like stop and we see the corner of the house. You can see,
You're like,
you know, this.
Get out of the car. You have to take this in one step at a time.
Well, no. So we actually, you know, because there were people walking around, I wasn't going to get out and, you know, start walking around. But I pulled up to then, you know, because it was an L-shaped house. L-shaped house. So I'm going to, yeah, whatever. L-shaped house.
Hold it right there.
Exactly. The local. Is that what that means? And so, you know, I pull up and I kind of like pull off to the side of the road just to let, you know, kind of like people walk by. And I'm sitting there and I'm staring at the house. And of course I roll the window down so that I don't have like little bug, you know, in the way of me taking pictures and stuff.
You don't want your camera focusing on the glass. I mean, everybody does an amateur move right there. Yeah.
Well, we'll post some pictures to my Instagram post of the amateur move of some pictures through glass.
Oh yeah.
some foreshadowing there too.
Right.
So okay. So we're out there, trucks idling. Well, people are like walking by and they're like, oh, more people staring at this house. And like, you know, it's got the people are programmed, right, to just assume, oh, there's going to be people stop. It's like, because everywhere we stopped, and there was a few places all the way down to our final destination of tours that we had stopped, you know, multiple times and did the drive by, and, you know, people were like looking at us like, oh, another one. And so then there was an older couple who had, rather than walking by, walked up to the truck. And of course, you know, I always have this kind of this spiel that I give. It's just like, don't mind me. I'm just an architecture nerd, you know, taking pictures of this beautiful house. You know, I just wanted to make it sound like I was not threatening or creepy or weird or a fanboy or all this other stuff. And they're like, oh, well, that's our house. And of course,
you're like, yeah, you're like, okay, this could go two ways. Either you're a creeper,
very much could,
or they're going to let you.
And what was amazing about it is they were very accommodating. And so they were at first they were like, oh, were you on the other week or, you know, like last month? And I'm like, no, we're just driving through. And then I kind of give them the story. It was like, you know, we decided to drive through Wisconsin on the long way home to Detroit. And they're like, they kind of like looked at us like, that was weird. And then she was like, oh, I used to work in Detroit. Hopefully it's getting better. And I was like, well, when was the last time you were there? And she's like, 1974. I'm like, it's changed a bit.
It's a little different.
It has changed a bit because like that was the year before our family left Michigan and moved to Florida. So we started to chat, and she proudly proclaimed, she's like, oh, my husband, and she kind of like points at, so it was Nick and Sylvia. I got a chance to talk to him a little bit. And so, you know, Sylvia points to Nick, and she was just like, you know, his grandfather was an architect. And he like looks at me, he's like, have you ever heard of Bertram Goodhue? And the name didn't immediately ring a bell. But he was just like, he was the architect on the Nebraska State House. Boom. That I know. I know that project. Okay. That's kind of a pretty amazing project because that actually was, so Paul Cret, and I never really know if I'm actually pronouncing his last name, you know, C-R-E-T, you know, so I'm pronouncing it the way that I, you know, but anyway.
The way you read it. Yep.
The way that I read it. And so has in where I finally realized Bertram Goodhue is that Paul Crett attributes a lot of his design sensibilities and stuff to Bertram Goodhue, because Bertram Goodhue was kind of just slightly before Paul Crett was, but was doing some of the same work, and they were both, kind of attributed as pioneers of introducing American architecture to Art Deco. And so if you kind of like do a little bit of research, I mean, Goodhue passed away early. He was pretty young. He was 40. But actually a decent amount of work actually out in Los Angeles, all over the place. And it was pretty amazing breadth of work for a pretty short career. So we started talking a little bit about that, and we just were kind of like chatting, and it was like telling me a little bit about the house, and, that it was one of, I believe, well, it was one of 3 models that was called the Erdem prototype. I believe it's prototype, but there was a builder that Frank Lloyd Wright at the very end of his career had worked with, because he'd always wanted to have the Usonian houses become basically a prefab house, and never got a chance to really have that take off. And so at the very end of his career, he, was working with a developer and developed 3 different house types, and only 2 different types were built. And this was one of them. And there was a handful of them, in the area. And so, we just started talking, and then she kept urging him. She's like, well, go and get, go and get a card. And, next time you guys are in town, why don't you let us know in advance? And, we'd love to show you around.
Just call me.
And so he rushes in and, comes back, and she's leaning on the truck, and, we're sitting there and we're talking, and she's just kind of getting to know us and get comfortable with us. And why are you people like skulking outside of our house kind of thing? And then, he comes back and he hands me the card, and then she looks at Nick and she's just like, let's just, and then she like looks at us and she's like, since you came all this way, why don't you just come on in? And I'm like, oh, okay.
You didn't even have to use the don't you know who I am statement.
Yeah, exactly.
As one of the co-hosts of Archispeak podcast.
Exactly. So I look over at my wife, and she's just like, oh, we, like both of us were like, I don't really want to. And I mean, like, you've been gracious enough just like standing out here and telling us the story of the house and everything else, but I don't want to bother you in your home. I mean, you're not expecting guests and visitors or anything like that. And so, we were just like,
a house like that though, Cormac, like at some level, you just have to always keep it picked up. Like there's no actual living in a Frank Lloyd Wright house. I have to imagine.
So I'll finish that thought of yours.
Okay.
So, I look over at my wife and I'm just like, do we go in? And she's just like,
you're looking for some backup.
Well, I was just like, I was looking at her like, hell yeah, this is an opportunity for us to do it. Let's do it. And she's just like, I don't really want to intrude on them. And they're just like, no, you came all this way, I mean, why not, like, come on in. So we're like, all right. So we pull into their,
insist.
Exactly. So one thing that I did learn, that these prototype houses, Frank Lloyd Wright, as we all may or may not know, but we are going to know now, hated garages, period. Hated garages. Everything was
a place to store your crap.
Exactly. He hated like storage and unnecessary rooms or bedrooms that were oversized to like carry anything more than you sleeping in it, because that was kind of like, the intent of the room was, oh, it's a bedroom. There's a bed. There's a room with a bed. And then you spend very little time in there. You spend doing just what you need to do, and then go back out into the community spaces, which was very much even this aspect too. But so we go in, and they go through the garage, we go through the front door, and even though it's a prototype house or a prefab house, it very much feels like his typical Usonian house. There's nothing that really screams anything until you go inside. and it's bigger. It feels vertically bigger than any of the houses that I've ever been in of Frank Lloyd Wright's, because there was the compression right at the front door. There's like a compression. There's a soffit that, you know, kind of like pulls you down. But then right as you get out of that, the kind of like entry area, it opens up, and it's not a very high pitched roof, but it's still like, you know, pitched ceiling, vaulted ceiling. And it just feels far more voluminous than any of the buildings any of the small single story houses that I've ever been in.
Okay.
And so
what's the main material that this place is made out of?
So it was kind of intended to be it was still intended to have local materials as like, you know, the siding and all of this other stuff. So, but it was a combination of both wood and stone, and the stone was actually carried into the house. And so there was areas in the kind of like the traditional horizontal, like board and batten type siding, like on the interior. That was very much it, you know, with kind of like this triangular batten that, you know, kind of like set like horizontal, like it was like every 12 inches, kind of this very horizontal kind of line work through there, but it worked beautifully with the stonework.
So is it just kind of Taliesin-ish in that regard? You think?
Yeah. I mean, how many Usonian houses have you been in?
None.
Because I've never, unfortunately, I've never been in Taliesin.
Oh, well, I mean, but I've been in the textile block, but that's different than Usonian, right?
Yeah. So Usonian, okay, so Usonian, because he uses basically wood interior, you know, like wood paneling on the interior, you know, wood siding on the exterior, and it kind of like translates on the inside and outside. There's like these like horizontal battens. And so we'll post photographs in the show notes or link to my Instagram page, which I've been copiously posting a lot of, you know, about the trip that I took. And you can even look and see some of my affinity for lighthouses, because I saw a lot of them. A lot. I think on this past weekend, and the weekend was literally 3 days long. Because Sunday was basically just drive back to Detroit and not really stop anywhere or anything like that. But Thursday, yeah, because Saturday comes after Thursday. Thursday, Friday, Saturday was all purely just like, you know, taking the kid up there. He literally unpacked the truck and moved into his room within 5 minutes, because everything was in bags, and he basically just took everything out of the bag and dumped it into like dumps.
He's a pro.
Oh nice. Yeah, pro.
He's a pro.
Going back to a previous episode where I was teaching kids how to pack. He also has mastered the unpacking.
Dump.
So exactly, dump.
Yeah, dump.
He open drawer, dump in. There you go. That was his unpacking. So here we are. We're in this house, and they're giving us this tour. And so where I was kind of like fast forwarding, or kind of like telling you about how I was going to finish your thought about the docents and the wealth of knowledge that they bring. What I found amazing was that owners, and this isn't the only owner that I've met. I actually met an owner that was the original owner that actually worked with and hired Frank Lloyd Wright. That was it was the Rosenbaum house in Florence, Alabama. So here, this is probably maybe, I don't know, third, fourth, possibly, you know, third or fourth owner of the house. And I don't know if, like, as you pass on the house, the library of Frank Lloyd Wright houses, or the, you know, the library of documentation of the house or things kind of like gets passed on to the next owner.
Yeah.
But every owner is such a steward of the house of Frank Lloyd Wright. I mean, there literally is a Frank Lloyd Wright Owners Association.
Yeah.
And they carry on the knowledge. They are telling the story as if they were the original owners of how the first owner, you know, had commissioned the house, how that builder had worked with Frank Lloyd Wright to develop these houses. I mean, they carried on the story, and it was really, really amazing that you become the next historian of that house.
Yeah,
and
the steward. Yeah,
exactly. And it was really kind of amazing. And they did not have to invite us into their house, but
right.
we were there for 2 hours. It was
That's
amazing. Awesome. Like, if I probably kept talking, because they wanted to keep talking and I wanted to keep hearing their stories, but I felt so bad that we were imposing on them, that we were trying to pull a Michigan exit, or, Midwestern exit, or however it is.
Right.
Like, okay, it's like, all right, well, time to go, kind of thing. It was just like trying to like, and they wanted, then the thing was, so after we got this great tour and learned a lot about the house, and it beautifully set in, the backyard kind of like falls off. And so there's a basement area, and that basement area kind of terraces down into the landscape. And then there's an upper terrace, and it's just it's the landscape, it's everything that I wish that I could do to a house that I, of course, either A, can never afford to do, or just don't have the property or the right house to do it in. But I mean, like, the way that it just captures the landscape was just amazing. I mean, this was a suburban house in a sea of ranchers, and nobody had that type of setting for both their house and their landscape. It was just like, everybody's was very kind of like vanilla suburbia kind of landscape. And then here you go, this kind of like, star of the show. It was, it was completely amazing.
I've had that experience a couple times with Schindler houses, like where when I was a student, one of my professors in second year was a Schindler aficionado. She'd written books about him, and she's at U of O now, University of Oregon. So Judith Shine, but I'm like, can you get me into these houses that we visited when I was a student? Can I go back? And so, I mean, it was like 2008 at this point. It was like quite a while ago, but I called her up and I said, hey, is there any way I can get into a couple of Schindler houses in LA? And she put me in direct touch with the owners. So it wasn't quite as serendipitous as your, pulling up on the curb and they just happen to be walking by. But getting to know the owner of the Tischler house and the Kalis house, who actually commissioned Rudolf Schindler to design and those houses with their needs, their input, their family size. And just, they've always lived there their whole life. Like, that was their place. Yeah. The stories, the insight is just, it's absolutely incredible.
And those are the stories that really do kind of need to be told, because those are, to me, you can look at a building, from, like an academic point of view, and it's fine. You get to understand the building, but
you
when
can
you
only
get to
know so much. Yeah.
Exactly. But when you get to have the conversation, so like when I, was at the Rosenbaum house, so this was sort of before we were planning on doing a tour in architecture school, but this was like, a semester or so away. And I was driving back and forth to northern Alabama because that was where my National Guard unit was. And so I was like, well, if I'm going to keep driving up here, I'm just going to go and drive, I'm going to keep driving like 2 extra hours, and I'm going to go and, find this house. And I do. And so I'm sitting across the street because, again, it's one of these things. I'm going to like go up and knock on somebody's door and, hey, I hear you got a Frank Lloyd Wright here. Tell me about it, kind of thing. No, not even remotely in my DNA to like intrude on somebody like that.
Right.
And so, but I am sitting on the curb across the street, kind of a catty corner to the house, and I'm sketching it. And, Mildred Rosenbaum was, when she was still with us and still living there, she I guess she was probably like, I think she was taking the garbage out or getting ready to take the garbage out, because fast forward, I took the garbage out for her. she saw me and she was like, "Hey, you, come here."
Stalker.
And it was just like, okay, little old lady tells you to come here, you come here.
You do it. Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
And so I walk across the street and she's like, "Are you an architect?" I'm like, "Well, I'm an architecture student." And I was actually in uniform, which was funny, is because I was like, just, I think it was, I don't know. I always like drove in uniform when I was up there because like I didn't bring a change of clothes. I was going to do my, and then drive back. And it also helped me get out of a couple of speeding tickets.
I'm sure. Look how practical you are.
Yeah, it was more about the speeding tickets really, because I got pulled over for doing some excessive speeds, and they're like, "Well, since you're a soldier, we'll knock it down to you were only doing 85 instead of 135." Seriously, it was you were about to go to jail, or we're going to knock it down to you were just barely speeding. We're still going to give you a ticket, but we're not going to haul you off to jail kind of situation. So, wow. Yeah, so I did sort of like, wear my uniform often.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, so, she goes in and she, brings me in and tells me all of these different stories and stuff. And, much like yours, there is nothing that will exchange, nothing in an academic textbook that is going to exchange the stories that you hear from the owner's perspective, especially the owners who commission these architects to do it.
Yeah.
And so, like your stories with the Schindler's houses and, these Wright houses that I, have had a chance to meet at least two of the owners of that, he just
current
like, the
owners,
wealth,
yeah, it's incredible.
Or original owner. Like with the Rosenbaum house, it was the original owner.
Right.
So it was just like complete, amazement that we were, got a chance to do that. So then, next day we, okay, now it's time to like, we got a hotel room, and actually I swear that they might have been on the verge, but, it's just like, well, we've got to go find a hotel room. They might have actually been on the verge of like, putting us up for the night, but I didn't want to push my luck because he had made a comment. He was just like, well, this is, normally if we know people are coming, this is where we put our guests. And he showed me like, the guest room, and amazing. Like, it was a huge room too. And like seriously, this was the most uncommon Frank Lloyd Wright house because it was big in comparison to a lot of the houses that I've been in from his. Even one of the other houses that I'm about to tell you about. And this was a mansion, and it was still small. Mm-hmm. So I do have to tell you a non-Frank Lloyd Wright house that we stopped by is as we were like driving by, and there was
I'm
Rick's
laughing
house
already because I've seen the photos.
So Rick's house, there was this house right on that kind of overlooked the park that was there was this amazing kind of like park system that they have right along in Milwaukee and Cudahy that are that front Lake Michigan. And so his house was on Lakeshore Drive, and we I'm driving past it, and I kind of like glance out of the corner of my eye. I'm like, you can't miss it. I'm like, what the? And so I like, did like multiple like, DC U-turns in the middle of the road, and kind of got back there, and I kind of pulled up, alongside the house, and he expects everybody to do this because you pull up and it is an art project. It is a 40-year long art project. He said that he had started, in his late 20s, early 30s, he had started this, and it just kept going. He's like, I'm in my 70s. And I looked at him like, wait, you're in your 70s? He did not look like he was in his 70s. I'm like, whatever you're doing, keep doing it.
It's that project. It's
exactly.
the project.
Yeah. And so it has to be. And so it's this amazing ongoing art project where the yard is littered with hand-painted sculptures. Like he'll rescue a big boy. I don't know if you are familiar with the Big Boy restaurant. So
Bob's Big Boy.
Yeah. So, like the little fat boy kind of carrying the burger on the plate and stuff. Well, he rescued one of those, And he had that in there, and he kind of like painted that up, differently than what it normally is. And then there was a couple of Colonel Sanders in the yard, and they were like, painted up. And then he had like all of like the Hall of Famers from the Green Bay Packers were painted as, they were fire hydrants, but he painted them as, the Hall of Famer. And then he like, has like his own artwork where he like welds and creates all of his own artwork, or builds like all of these like, sculptures and stuff. And they're just like incredible. Big, massive skull on the side of his house, like massive. We're talking about like 6 foot tall. But in the front, there's this 50s Chevy, and it's half buried in the front yard. And we're not talking about a big house, and we're not talking about a big yard, but he's got a full Chevy, like kind of like pitched and buried in this thing. And so we'll definitely be putting some links to my photographs on this one, because it literally is something, to be seen.
It reminded me of when I was down in the Palm Springs area visiting my mom and dad, and we went to the Salton Sea, and there's two artist camps out there. One's called Salvation Mountain, and one's called East Jesus. And it's very Burning Man in that kind of art installation, sculpture, big, like larger than life artwork installations. And it's just like, when I saw your photos, I was immediately reminded of that experience that I'd had. And it's unusual because you don't see it very often. But,
No.
But it's pretty incredible.
And it was so funny is because he was so I get out. I'm like, I've got to get out and I've got to look at this. And my wife's like, not again. And so
she's like, embarrassed.
She stayed in the truck while I'm out there. And then of course she like looks and realizes that I've been out there for like 20 minutes. And I just happened to, his garage was open. He had a detached garage, and his garage was open. And I saw a couple of hot rods in there, and I just wanted to like kind of like glance there, and he was standing there, and I was just like, excuse me, don't mean to bother you, but this is amazing. And, he was just, oh, thanks. And he came out, and we just started talking. And I was like, how did, like, what
how did
drew
you get
you to
away
doing
with
this? Well, it was funny enough is he was telling me a story about how one of his neighbors wanted to put up a fence, and it exceeded the plot limits where he wanted to put the fence. And they were like, absolutely not. You can't put your fence there. And he was like yelling and screaming at the zoning commission at the meeting. Like, this guy can put a Cadillac in his front yard, bury a Cadillac in his front yard, but I can't put up a fence. Because I was asking him, like, what do your neighbors think? I mean, to me, this is amazing. He's just like, other than that one guy with the fence, everybody else loves it because it brings people, it kind of brings people to the neighborhood. He's like, funny. He is the number one hit for people who actually drive to their neighborhood during Halloween, for Halloween, to see his house. So I believe if you look up the hashtag Keep Cudahy, and it's CUDHA, AHY. We'll put it in the show notes. But anyway, Keep Cudahy Fun. And that kind of is the hashtag that.
Okay. It's like keep Austin weird, keep Portland weird.
Exactly. And his is, but he had, and you would love this as being a petrolhead like me, is like, so he had, a couple of different hot rods, like 30s era Fords that were some hot rods. And then he was telling me about this one hot rod that he had that he absolutely loved, but he had to get rid of it because he needed to make, both. He wanted a new project, and he went as far as he could with that project. So he sold it so that he could go out and buy this brand new hot rod that was like brand new. It was a 60s. It was a 60s kind of like gasser, but it was just this amazing car that he's like restoring. And he was fawning all over them, and we were talking about that, and he was just like, "Oh, come on!" It's like we were walking around his little 2-car garage, looking at like all of the memorabilia within, like the kind of like automobile themed memorabilia within his garage. And then all of like the art stuff, like out in his yards, like yards, backyard, side yard, front yard, the only 3 yards that he had, completely filled with it. The one thing is that at least it keeps it from, he doesn't have to do any more lawn mowing.
You gotta weed the car in the yard.
Yeah. So then we get down to where we were going, which is Racine. And we had the opportunity to sign up for two actual tours, docent-led tours. And they were both for S.E. Johnson Foundation. And the S.E. Johnson Foundation, obviously anybody who's a architecture nerd or architecture student that, of Frank Lloyd Wright knows of the Johnson Wax Administration Building and also the lab building. And we had an opportunity to tour that. We also had an opportunity to tour H.F. Johnson's, which was the third generation of Johnson's running the Johnson. It actually is still a family run. There's like H.F. Johnson III is running it now. They're the house that Frank Lloyd Wright designed for H.F. Johnson was called Wingspread, and it is amazing. It's this pinwheel. If you look at the plan from above, it's a pinwheel, and it was intended to be a pinwheel to kind of show motion and stuff, and it absolutely does. But what was kind of amazing about it is, so we get to Wingspread. We did Wingspread first, and then the administration building and the lab building second. And so we get to the house, and I know we were early. I played it off that I didn't know that we were early. And I was like, oh, how dumb of me. I forgot to set my watch to Central Time Zone. I'm still on Eastern. My wife's like, you're an idiot. It's just like, but I was like, we walked in and she's just like, can I help you? I was like, well, we're here for a tour, but I just realized that we're actually an hour early. And so we can go back and wait for our tour. But I just, wanted to kind of check in. She's like, oh, no. How about this? The people, who are here now for the 11 o'clock tour. So we were doing the 12 o'clock tour. They're doing their self-guided tour. What we can do, we can let you watch the 20-minute video. And then once that's done, you can do your self-guided tour, which is usually the last thing on this. You have a block of an hour, and it's usually the last thing that you do. And then you can go, and after you do your self-guided tour, then meet me back here, and then I could go through my spiel, which is about a 20-minute spiel on the history and a lot of other things that aren't really covered in the video, because the video is actually done by Sam, I guess it would be S.C. Johnson, the second or third or whatever, but the son of the guy who had this house commissioned. And it was done by him. The video was done by him and his sister talking about, growing up in Wingspread. And so we watched that. And so then we had the opportunity to basically go on this tour, this walking, the self-guided walking tour. But what was amazing about that is because somebody played it off that they didn't know how to set their watch back. We had the entire house to ourselves. There was not one single person. The docents were in their office, because we still had like 40 minutes before the next one. We had 40 minutes to basically walk around this house and experience everything and tour and look and miss the part in her spiel where it says don't open things, because anyway, I don't want to say anything because I'm never going to get invited back to any of these things, but but I mean, it was pretty amazing to be able to walk around there. And he has, so I guess back in, the Kaufman House, Falling Water, here he is, this is, this guy who is a department store man, right? And in the department stores, they have basically all of the piped in music in the department stores. There's this certain type of like turntable system that they have for the department stores. It's like a jukebox on steroids, but it's something very specific for department stores. Well, Johnson had one of those put into his house. And of course it's playing throughout this whole time. And it's so, because, it's like playing, like all of this 50s music, like late 40s, 50s kind of music and stuff. And it's just kind of like filtering through the whole, there was even some green sleeves going on there. And, you know, it was just like this, it was just like filtering through. And so it was just kind of like fun because the whole thing about this is that it was really built as, well, first of all, it was built for a blended family because this was his second wife and she had kids and then his kids. And so it was like, you know, to come together and kind of like, you know, have the center core of this house, so the center portion of that pinwheel was really about community and family. And so it was this big, massive volume. And he didn't really want to have his son. His son loved to kind of like, you know, follow his dad when his dad was like, his dad was an avid pilot. And he used to kind of like basically buzz the house every time, like, you know, he was out flying. So the kid knew when his dad was coming home. Well, so Frank Lloyd Wright built in. So when you look at some of the photographs that I posted, you're going to see this kind of spiral staircase. Mm-hmm. And that spiral staircase went to the birdhouse type thing. And if you look at the exterior shots, you're going to see this like little glass, kind of almost like a widow's walk type thing. But, you know, it was specially built for the son to be able to go up there and take a two-way radio with, you know, that his father had, the other one in his airplane. And so basically he would be able to like talk to his dad while his dad was like flying overhead. It was really kind of cool.
That's incredible. You know? So my only experience with, and I'm super jealous that you got to go visit that place, is because the first two like pieces of architecture that I was ever aware of in my entire life. So I was always interested in house plans. And there was a few house plan books. I know we've talked about this before, like B. Dalton Bookseller in the mall, or, you know, I would go find these books and I wanted to draw these floor plans because they were like nothing I had ever seen. You know, like a typical house plan book is just, you know, a typical house plan book. But there was one of Frank Lloyd Wright's house plans, and it was the Roby house and it was Wingspread. Like those were the two first houses that I was ever exposed to real architecture in. And I still to this day have these vivid memories of those floor plans. And so when you're talking about the pinwheel plan, it's like I can pull it right up. And I had to be like, I don't know, 8 years old when I saw that. Yeah. And so when you talk about the spiral staircase that goes like that hearth, that fireplace, that all that stuff is just like, it's seared in my memory forever. And actually going to the Kaufman house, you know, going to Falling Water and seeing the kettle that they have there. Brought me right back to Wingspread. Right. And I don't know order wise, which one came first, but it's a very similar idea for sure, if not design. So.
You know, it's interesting. I'm going to have to look at that because they do have a very similar kettle there too. So there is a shot that I don't think that I posted because I took so many. I mean, the good thing about being able to like walk around by yourself in there, I took tons and tons of photographs, and I didn't have to wait for people to like, you know, get out of the way because nobody was in my way.
Right.
I was the only person.
That's
in my
amazing.
way. But he did on the second floor. So like right to the side of where the spiral staircase is, on the second floor, there's this vertical fireplace, and it was intended to be where you took the logs and you stacked them vertically. And so when you let it on fire, you know, it has this spectacular flames and all this other stuff. And they're kind of like going up vertically. Boy, did he get that one wrong. Because apparently he did not understand the properties of how things burn. Because he said that the first time that they ever use it, they said that they like use it like once.
Yeah.
Because when they
form over function, right?
They started falling out, and there was like burning logs falling all over the place, and they were just like
shooting
freaking
embers out into the living room.
Exactly. It was not really designed the way it looks. Great. It looks fantastic. It does not perform.
Yeah.
It is not functional. You know, kind of like the sealant around every single window in that house. Because they did tell another story of like, he was hosting some dignitaries and they were sitting at the dining room table in this big grand area. And it's got this 3 levels of clear story above him. And they're all kind of like, slanted and whatnot. And he's sitting there and it's raining outside. And the son is looking at the dad. The dad is looking at the son like, we know what's coming next. And sure enough, he's sitting there with his bald head and it's like drip. And then it's pouring down his face. Drip, pouring down his face. He's sitting there with such a stoic look on his face of just like, here I am with all these dignitaries and stuff. And the house is leaking on me. And so just like without missing a beat, he called to, one of the servants and said, bring me the phone. Brought the phone over, and they basically said, this was before, like he had direct dial or something like that. They said, get me, they said, give me Frank Lloyd Wright in Scottsdale, Arizona. Cause he was in, Taliesin West at the time. He's like, get me him on the phone right now. He sat there and he waited, and he said, sure enough, Frank Lloyd Wright picked up, and he just like laid into it. It was just like one of the first clients that like just tore Frank a new one. And it was basically complaining about the fact that, I think they said something like there's like 150 or 550, something like some obscene amount of windows in this house. Oh, wow. Every single one of them leaked.
Oh my.
Now they don't. Because I will say this, like, what's kind of interesting about what's interesting about Frank Lloyd Wright is that the ideas were way ahead of the technology to be able to accomplish what he wanted to accomplish. The technology to, for like waterproofing or reinforcing or whatever just didn't exist. Right. Not the way that he wanted to do it. There's like these super thin concrete planks, cantilevered concrete planks. Yeah. And it's just like, I wonder why they're sloping. It's just like, well, it's because he wanted him super thin. It's just like thinking it, about like all of the work that it went into restoring falling water. Like if we had the technology, if he built it today off of the technology that we have today, we wouldn't have these issues.
There's
we
other
be talking about
that would have to be made though.
Yeah. Well, sure. So then fast forward to going to the C. Johnson. We always call it like the Johnson Wax building, right? I don't know if you ever call it like the Johnson Wax building. Yeah. So the Johnson Wax it's not even the company name. It's just one of the products that they make was wax. Which one of the things that I didn't know is they actually started as a flooring company, a wood flooring company is what S.E. Johnson started with. And it was S.E. Johnson and Sons wood flooring. But then they started making wood floor care products. And that actually started to outsell the commissions for the wood floors. And so they basically just switched to basically being a wood flooring product and then, becoming, what they are now with cleaners and all sorts of other things. Like, you go into basically a little visitor center at the headquarters and they've got like all of the different products, it's just like Drano and whatever else there. So it's almost everything. If you look in, scrubbing bubbles, Windex, whatever, it's all them. So, but it is kind of cool. So then we get there, and this was in a way somewhat disappointing of a tour for one reason. And this is, I will never understand this. And there's several Frank Lloyd Wright houses that this is the standard operating procedure. I think Falling Water is one of them. You are not allowed to take, unless you pay for like another tour, but this one doesn't even offer, any kind of tour. You're not allowed to take interior photographs. And I'm just like, I am here because I want to take pictures of the tulip columns, these like mushroom headed column things and stuff like that in this whole space, this space that we know so much about from our picture books.
Yeah.
I want to take a picture of those. I don't want a picture book. I want a picture.
There's already pictures of those.
Normally, you kind of like, so like they have that same rule at the Glenstone. And I'm pretty sure if you guys follow my Instagram, you see some interior shots of the Glenstone. Because I will, like I know where to stand and sneak pictures and things like that. Can't do that because there's a docent leading the pack, and there is a security guard at the back. And I usually fall into the back so that I could sneak those pictures. Nah, dude was literally right behind me. I kept looking back at him, was just like, "You're gonna bust me if I try to take a picture, aren't you?" And he's like, "Yeah." I was like, "So would you like throw me out?" You know, I had him cracking up. I was like, "Are you gonna throw me out, or are you just gonna yell at me?"
You're just gonna slap.
He's
my
like,
hand.
"Well, you know." He's like, "Well, he has, you know, protocol is that we're supposed to, like, you know, escort you out." I'm like, "Oh, cool. Then I can take a picture and then get thrown out." And then he's just like, you know, he goes, "Let's not." I'm like, "Come on, let me take a picture."
Okay, so what was it actually like? Okay, because we've all seen, I hope everybody has seen the picture that you're talking about with the columns that go up and they bloom out at the top. What's it like to be in that space?
So I will say this, and again, to the link to the photographs that I took, you will be able to see a semi-obscured picture of it. I mean, you're still going to be able to see the columns and stuff, kind of like off in the distance, kind of like through a lower vestibule and a low space, which was kind of like the bridge that kind of goes across. And then it kind of like opens up into this, you know, this massive double height space. Actually triple height space.
Yeah,
so,
I was going to say it feels
atrium,
really tall.
Yeah. Atrium that doesn't have a, you know, smoke evac system. Again, something that he wouldn't be able to do today, because like all of these offices and stuff open up into the atrium. And the only way for you to like get around the code are some like little tricks that I learned to be able to get around them, but to also to avoid having a smoke evac system. But anyway, it was the space was amazing. The only thing that would like gives me pause on the space is, okay, he also designed all of the furniture too, because that's what he does. You know, they had those seats in the lobby of the visitor center, you know, where you check in. And we went and we sat down. My wife sat down first, and then I sat down like right after her, and she was just like, "Oh, damn, this is uncomfortable." You know, you're just like, yeah. And so that was
not his concern.
Apparently, though, so these chairs, they're round chairs with a round back that kind of like rotates, but doesn't lean back or anything. Like I am sitting in an Aeron chair right now. And they were just like, he had designed these chairs and it had 3 wheels on it. And it was intended to be, because Frank believed in perfect posture. And so if you sat in it perfectly, you wouldn't fall over. But because the chairs were so uncomfortable, they called them the screamer chairs, because throughout the day you would hear somebody scream as they're falling over. I was just like, come on, this is
how fun is that?
Exactly. There was so like fun. And so again, H.F. Johnson calls up Frank and says, "I am having too many people fall over in these chairs. What are you going to do about it?" He's like, "Make them sit properly." Ooh, that was his answer to them. He's like, no. You're going to fix this. And so he ultimately ended up designing a 4-wheel one and the reason why he designed the 4-wheel one is he actually had Frank come back to the headquarters and he sat him in one of those 3-wheel chairs, because he was just like, you know, I've never fallen over in these chairs. You know, they're just not sitting in these chairs properly. He said that he had positioned a pencil at the edge of the table and strategically knocked the pencil off the ground and said, "Hey, could you hand me that pencil?" And when Frank leaned over to grab the pencil, he fell out. He went toppling over. And I was just like, oh, that's so great. And so they were like, you know, if you were in this situation, what would you do? And you hear from the background, I call Herman Miller and get a bunch of Aeron chairs. And then you automatically knew where the architects were on the tour, because they all were snickering. And then there was, of course, like people were like, I don't get what he's saying, but you could tell the architects were just like, yep, I would too.
I've owned an Aeron chair for like 20 years, and man, that chair is a tank. That is a super tank. It's a tanker.
I love it. You know, I mean, I've got lower back issues and all of this other stuff, but when I sit in this one all day long, it's comfortable. And,
Life of an
you know,
architect.
life of an architect. Yeah.
Sitting in a chair all day
So,
long.
so I wasn't able to get any photographs of the actual building itself, but it's a pretty amazing space. But so they did have to install carpet because apparently they called the floors clackers because all day long, you know, like the whole the
I love
whole
how everything has a name.
they had
You
all
have
these like
screamer
nicknames.
chairs and clackers. Yeah.
You know, they had like all of these like nicknames for like all the different like issues that they had to like work around this building.
That's
Because
amazing.
like this was, you know, back in the day when, you know, the whole thing was the secretarial pool and things like that. So it was all women working in here and they were all in high heels. And he basically like all day
Right.
long.
All day long.
And they
Yeah.
said it was just drove people crazy. And but the desks were kind of like these amazing like Frank Lloyd Wright desks that were just like really, really cool looking desks. Not necessarily comfortably functional when you were, you know, they had like these rounded like slide out, not like a slider, like, you know, you here, I'm gonna like do a little thing like you pull straight out. No, these like swung out.
Mm-hmm.
And he's just like, oh, so you could, he goes, I did it that way so that you could be able to get to like the back of the, you know, like instead of like having to like reach to the back of the desk, you know, the back of the drawer, you know, you can see everything in the drawer. I was like, the problem is that because it's rounded, you can't put anything in, you can't put paper in there. He designed
That's hilarious.
the paper that they wrote on to be small enough. So it wasn't 8.5 by 11. It was smaller than that so that it could fit into his desk that he had properly designed. It was like, well, you know, I mean, exactly. Right. And so then we go into what anybody today would call, so we go into the lab building and what every lab designer or any architect would call is just a folly of OSHA violations. Amazing. So let me get this out of the way. Amazingly beautiful design. Art moderne, right? You know, not necessarily known for him being known for that, but a beautifully executed art moderne building that honestly was probably better than anybody else's. Period. Like it's an amazing building.
Wow.
So all of, you know, it's got the center core structure, these floor plates. So like every other floor plate is a round disc. And then so it's round and square, round and square, round and square. So when you look at the building, because of the types of windows that he used for it, which were basically Pyrex tubes that bent in the curve and then just stacked together, which do not keep you warm or cool throughout the year. It's an absolute disaster of a type, but still amazing as hell. You can see you can see the impression of the intermediate floors kind of like hovering back. And then when you see the light kind of like coming through it, it just kind of gives you that silhouette of this curvaceous kind of like silhouette from the interior. It's so like, you look at it and you're incredible. Like, damn, that's so cool. But then me looking at it, it's just like, you can't, like, you look at like the fume hoods, you look at the way that, you know, like all of like these open flames and everything else, and all of like the way the labs are that we design labs to now, because I'm doing a lab right now, versus the labs that he designed. They were both functional and aesthetic. You know, we usually design things more for function, not aesthetic. Of course. But these were badass. They were.
What year was this?
It was in the 30s.
So almost 100 years ago. Like,
yeah.
I mean, to put it into context, that's pretty crazy. That it like aesthetically still makes an impact on you 90 years.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course, it's not going to measure up to today's standards in as far as functionality, OSHA, code, all those things. But it's just like that got built. Like that's a real thing that you can go visit and take a tour of. And
it's an occupiable, usable sculpture. Because I mean, there's no way that you can't call that sculptural as much as a functional building. What's interesting about the way that I look at the building. So like, then you stop criticizing. It's like, oh, you'd never be able to do this today kind of thing. Forget that. Again, put that aside. And you look at what he was doing at that time when nobody else was doing that. This was essentially insulated glass without them being an insulated glass. Now, was it a successful insulated glass? No, it wasn't. Here we were. It was a maybe 70-degree day. It was nice cool breeze outside. We go inside the building. We're sweating. Everybody's sweating. It was the stack effect that was going on and everything else. It wasn't comfortable, but it was amazing. It was still amazing though. The thing about it is there's one stair for this entire tower. There's one elevator, one stair. There's really, really kind of like cool, but weird bathrooms like in the stair, so you go into the stairwell and so there's the stairwell and the bathrooms all in the same space. And it's just like, you definitely can't do that today. There's like weird. So many codes that, against all of that, but they were so, and because everything was rounded, the bathroom door was this rounded metal door that was on, basically kind of like a barn door type thing, like on a top track that rolled with it. But it wasn't like an accordion door or anything. It was a solid door that was just round and it would just like roll and roll. Cool. It was just like, I was like, that's just cool. Like,
it reminds me of, I went to the Sheets Goldstein residence by John Lautner in LA, which is like one of the really famous houses that he did.
Yes.
Right. And there's this glass curtain wall that is no mullions at all between the living room and like this outdoor deck that's right in front of a pool. So there's a roof that shoots over the whole thing, which is kind of Lautner thing, right? It was like this big roof over a series of spaces. And the roof was always like the major form. And then the spaces were kind of worked out by furniture, low partition walls, change in elevation, things like that on the interior of the houses. There's glass there. Somebody walked right into the glass, right? Because it's like, it feels like one big space, indoor and outdoor space. It just feels like a big space. And what was interesting was to find out from the docent that glass was not in the original design. There was an air curtain. So John Lautner used a lot of like, quote unquote, advanced technologies in his designs, where he would design these technologies to fit the architecture, which is kind of like what you're talking about with Frank Lloyd Wright, right? Well, it was very ahead of its time because there was nothing on the market that actually did what he wanted it to do. And well, in LA, there's this air curtain, and it was like, it never gets cold in LA. Like that was the idea, right? And it was like, no, it gets freezing cold in LA in the wintertime for people who live in LA, at least. Maybe if you live in the Midwest, it's a little different of a standard. But it was like, the air curtain didn't work, and they went back in and they put in frameless glass at some point. But what's interesting to me is like they addressed the issue. And what you're talking about is like these advancements have been made and they have kept it how it was. Yeah. So it's kind of this time capsule of a project.
It's funny, as I was thinking about it, it's like, could you go in and retrofit, not really change the overall design, but retrofit it, like to be, maybe more high performance or something. And you could basically come in, with like glass behind it or something like that, kind of like creates like a triple pane window or something like that. But you wouldn't want to mess with it. I mean, because there was such a simplicity to it. So it's funny is like, so both of the architects that you had mentioned, Schindler and Lautner, what do they have in common? They were both they were both apprentices to Frank Lloyd Wright.
Yeah.
And wing spread, that big massive cantilever, was something that helped launch Lautner's career, because he was the one who actually made big, huge cantilever work when he was working for Frank Lloyd Wright.
Yeah.
And so somebody had told me that. And before I kind of like went and started to repeat it, I actually did a little bit of research to make sure that was in fact true. And it was in fact true. And what was interesting about, so then I started reading more and more about Lautner, and Lautner's kind of like very intentional career when he went out on his own is that he had learned a lot. And you read stories about him, and he will attribute to almost all of his knowledge to Frank Lloyd Wright, to Mr. Wright. He will continue to call him Mr. Wright. People who worked for him, they called him Mr. Wright. And so he will always attribute everything that he knew to that. But he wanted to distinguish himself from being just an apprentice of Frank Lloyd Wright. And so all of his buildings are purposely designed to not embody any of the things, any of the style that he learned and that he was drawing and detailing for Frank Lloyd Wright. None of that kind of like leached into his work. There's a lot of other apprentices, Alden B. Dow, Bruce Goff, all of these other ones that still have that have a lot of like Wright to them, even though they still have their own character. They still have Wright as kind of like as an embodiment of those, of like the moves that they did.
Right.
Him, he purposely, and it was, you have to applaud it, because the way that he did it though, it wasn't like he was thumbing his nose at Frank and saying, I'm going to do it my way. He held him in very high regard, but he was just like, I got my style too, dude. And and I know you love him. And, I got a book like literally sitting right behind me of, the Tash and Lautner book. I, had been flipping through that. I don't think that I actually ever bought them to read them, but I've been reading them because of everybody's connection to, it's so funny. It's like Schindler, Neutra. I mean, one of my favorites, right. Neutra, all these different people who have connections to Wright, but we don't normally connect them to it. And reading this book that I was telling you about, that I do suggest people read, even get the audiobook, because it's actually a really good storytelling that you can kind of keep in the background. But how Neutra left Wright, there was one point in time where they actually were cordial to each other, and and then I guess there was some point that they became arch enemies. And it was just like, there was just like, they both went to the grave hating each other.
Architecture games. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly.
Like Hunger Games.
Yeah. And the thing was, what was it? His Kaufman house. I think that was the breaking point, but Frank actually said that he loved that house, but I think that was, I got to do a little bit more reading, but I think that was actually the breaking point, because he felt betrayed by the client that he went with somebody else.
Yeah. Wow.
Oh
man. Well, I'm super jealous of your tours that you got to do. That's so cool.
And that was only 2 buildings of so many other buildings on the Frank Lloyd Wright Trail. If anybody is in Wisconsin, do yourself a favor. And if, aficionado of architecture, do yourself a favor and download the Frank Lloyd Wright Trail app, because it kind of like tells you some stories and stuff. And, you've got places that you can post photographs on, and you can check in and just kind of like little tick off of,
how cool.
That you've been there. But
it's like my national parks book that I have. That I can go get stamped off every.
Exactly. Yeah. Or if you have the National Park app, you can also you can like click that you've been there. Right. And stuff. So they
have that for Frank Lloyd Wright status.
And they've got the Frank Lloyd Wright Trail that they do that too. But the thing is that you just stumble onto there's so many private residences that aren't on the Frank Lloyd Wright Trail, that if you just do a little bit of research, we started like defaulting to Googling. It's just like Frank Lloyd Wright buildings near me.
Yeah.
And they would be like this house or this house or this house. And they're all still private residences. And you, of course, can't go and tour them. Right. But they're...
Peek up over the fence.
Yeah. You can peek up over the fence. One of his largest prairie-style houses, I think last Prairie House, or do they consider it Usonian? I'm going to have to go back and look now. But anyway, so Johnson... Let me do one last story about the Johnson wing spread house. So I told you that it was built for his second wife and kind of their blended family. And before wing spread was finished, his second wife passed away. And so her kids never lived in the house, and his kids did. So they grew up there. They moved to the house, and they, were growing up there. And so then he remarried, and this was a Hollywood actress, and she was kind of like, she was the ruler of the roost and all of this other stuff. And so she had moved in, and they really hadn't been there that long. And they were hosting, apparently Frank was known to kind of drop in on people, his former clients and all this other stuff, and stay in his houses. This is not they're stewards of his stuff. And so he was there, and so he was staying there, and they had made some food, and they were using sitting in chairs that, were not his, because he had designed the chairs for him. And there was furniture that was not his, and they were all in
other chairs,
and they were all in storage on the grounds. So in the middle of the night, you know where the story is going. In the middle of the night, Frank Lloyd Wright went into the storage and took all of her furniture out of the house. It put all of his furniture back in the house. And so there's this perch, that you overlook the big main area. And she's coming out of the kitchen, and she's seeing all of this, and it's what's going on? And he's standing there kind of chest puffed up, and then he was just like, "Isn't this better?" And she was just like, "Mr. Wright, I want you to leave my house right now. Just pack your stuff and get out." And kicked him out. And then they commissioned another architect to build another house on the site, basically just a little bit up the hill. So if you go outside, you see the other house that they had built, and they moved out and grew up and moved into that house because of spite. Despite him, she did that. And then they turned the wing spread is actually still to this day a functioning conference center, where they had actually world leaders came together, and had some of the things that had happened there is the EPA was established there. The World Bank was established there. And all sorts of different things were discussed at Wingspread. So not only is Wingspread, this kind of have this really interesting story about Frank Lloyd Wright and architecture and the client and things like that, but then it also has this connection to so many different world events that happened.
Wow.
So it was pretty amazing.
Kind of a significant thing. That's cool.
Yeah. So,
all right.
I'm going to have to go back to the trail. You need to come out here, and we can hit the trail together.
I think a tour is in order, man. This is going to be a,
yeah.
I mean, we did a little tiny bit of it when we were in Chicago, right?
Right.
That just kind of whet the appetite, or the,
yeah.
There's just a huge concentration of work to see out there.
Yep. Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
All right, man. Well,
till next time.
Chat with you soon.